Oh, okay, we'll go ahead and get started today. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our first chapter Zoom meeting. I'm Neil Sikora, the president of the Wild Ones Kalamazoo Area chapter. I hope you had a good summer enjoying the outdoors and your native plantings like I did. If you can see a virtual background behind me, that's from a photo from my native plantings this summer. If you are a Kalamazoo Area chapter member, please be sure to check the latest issue of our Seedlings magazine, our Seedlings newsletter rather, or our Facebook page for important information about our upcoming chapter elections. Your participation is needed and vitally important. During our program, we ask that you keep your audio setting on mute. If you do wish to ask a question of our speaker, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We will assemble them and ask our speaker to answer as many as possible. Now I'd like to introduce Mike Klug, who will introduce our speaker this evening.
Thanks, Neil. Well, it's a pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Dave Warners, Professor of Biology at Calvin University and Director of the Plaster Creek Stewards. Dr. Warner's current research focuses on how to engage local communities to work together to restore the Plaster Creek watershed. The project is multidisciplinary and multifaceted, involving the propagation of native plants for revegetation of shorelines, understanding the overall stream hydrology, and assessment of the overall water quality by monitoring microbial and invertebrate populations. He has conducted many botanical inventories for townships, state parks, and helped schools, churches, and parks establish native plantings. He has served on the board of the West Michigan Land Conservancy and served as a consultant to the Nature Conservancy and other agencies. Tonight, Dave's presentation, Native Shrubs and Trees, the Rodney Dangerfields of Residential Landscapes, will focus on the important roles that shrubs and trees play in maintaining biodiversity. So take it away, Dave.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Let me share my screen here. Okay. Very good. Thank you for the introduction. It's really nice to be virtually with you. It would have been much better if I could be down there. I have spoken to this group a couple of times in the past and have really enjoyed your community. So it's one thing I wanted to say at the outset is thanks a lot for inviting me. And I wish we could be meeting in person, but I do want to send you strong encouragement to keep up your camaraderie in your group and all the good work that you're doing down there in Kalamazoo. The second thing I wanted to say before I launch into this presentation is that a lot of what I have put into this talk, and in fact, a lot of what I've learned about using native plants in landscaping has come from just practicing putting plants in the ground right here in my own yard. So this is the kind of thing where our yards can become classrooms very quickly. Once we start putting the plants in, trying this here or that there, and then seeing who shows up to benefit from the presence of that plant. It's somewhat magical sometimes to see the creatures that come when we put the right plants out there. So a lot of these plants and a lot of these pictures are just right from here in my backyard. And I don't live out in a beautiful natural area necessarily. I live in Alger Heights. It's pretty, but it's a neighborhood. It's an urban neighborhood in southeastern Grand Rapids, and just a very regular sized lot here. So in case you're not sure who Rodney Dangerfield is, he was a stand-up comedian, probably back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I remember him when I was a kid growing up. His famous line was, "I don't get no respect." And then he would riff off of that and talk about how horribly people had treated him. It's real self-deprecating humor. So I do feel like the native trees and shrubs don't get the same kind of attention that, say, the beautiful, glamorous, herbaceous wildflowers get, you know, the Coreopsis and the coneflowers and things like that. That's oftentimes what draws people into native landscaping. But these are kind of like the workhorses. They are incredibly supportive of biodiversity. And I'll play that out here in the presentation. Kind of as an on-ramp into this topic, and I know you guys are all on board, but landscaping to promote biodiversity, you know, why bother? It's a lot easier just to mow the grass. Why is it that we go to these extra lengths to put native plants in and coax them along, keep the weeds out, et cetera, et cetera? Well, there's a very good reason why we are committed to this kind of work, and it's because our biodiversity is in decline. I'm going to show you a series of graphs here. This is from the US Geological Survey back in 2015. It shows extinction rates globally in the red and human population growth in the blue. So, you know, neither of those curves are headed in a good direction. I don't know if you were aware, but in 2018, this was an article from the New York Times that was reporting on work done in Denmark and Germany. But this quickly became known as the insect apocalypse, where numbers of insects in various places had declined up to 75% just over over 3 decades in time. And when insects are in such a steep decline, there's so many other species that are going to be stressed as well. So in some ways, it wasn't a big surprise in 2019 when Cornell came out with a report that nearly 3 billion birds, this is North America, so US and Canada, have been lost in the last 50 years. And that's 30% of the bird life here in North America. If you didn't notice, September 10, here's another report. The world lost 2/3 of its wildlife in 50 years. We are to blame. This is World Wildlife Fund that came out with this report. All right, so, I throw up a graph of climate change in case you're not depressed enough. You know, atmospheric carbon dioxide in the red globally, and then the average global temperature in the blue. It doesn't take a genius to consider some of these findings and realize we need to find new ways of doing things. We're not headed in a good direction. And the window is closing fairly rapidly on our opportunity to turn things around. So what you're doing with planting native plants in your yard is one way. I mean, sometimes we feel helpless in the face of these trends, but no, this is something very tangible that we can do. And so what you're doing is very good work. I really like this guy, Craig Childs. He's somewhat of a modern day Henry David Thoreau. I probably mentioned him the last time I gave a talk to you guys, but he's worth reminding you of. Wrote a book called Soul of Nowhere. Well, I think what I like about him is he spends large periods of time out in wilderness areas all by himself. Sometimes he just walks out without any supplies and lives off the land. A real survivalist, and then he writes about his experiences. And you know, I would think that someone who is so connected to the land and so has so much affection and deep care for the land would be really disappointed at some of those trends that I just showed you. But he was interviewed in a journal called The Sun, and one of the quotes that came out of that interview really caught my attention. And here it is. He says, "I'm amazed by the good we can do. We are not just a devouring species eating everything in our path. We're also a species that preserves ecosystems, that cleans up rivers, that puts seeds in the ground. We aren't just destroyers, we are repairers too." All right. And I hear in his words kind of a call for turning things back in the direction of the repairers more. We've been doing destroying for quite some time, and those graphs that I just showed you give evidence of that. But how about if we tip the scales back and take on more of this repairer identity? And one way we can begin repairing the damage is by landscaping with native plants. It might seem like a small thing, but lots of small things can add up to big things. All right, now an intro story from just this summer. The work we do at Plaster Creek Stewards, you know, we raise a lot of native plants, and then we use them in a lot of our restoration projects to help to improve the water quality of the creek. And we also have people who hear about the native plants and they want to buy some for their yard. And so we do a little bit of that too. I had a woman call me up and ask if we had any swamp mallow. And I said, you know what, I think we do, just a couple. And she said, oh, good, because I just love that plant and I really want to put some in my yard. I said, okay, let me see if I can find it. So I found these 3 plants, and I excitedly texted her back and said, yeah, that's right. I was right. We do have 3 plants, and I'll put them, we have this yellow picnic table. That's where we put our orders. So they're on the yellow picnic table. You can come pick them up. And she said, all right, I'm coming tonight. Thanks so much. All right. The next morning I got to the greenhouse, and there were the 3 swamp mallows sitting right there on the yellow picnic table. So I texted her and said, did you not have a chance to get here last night? And she said, no, I did. But when I looked at the plants, I saw the leaves had lots of holes in them. And I didn't want to put some plants out there that the insects were going to eat up. Right. I was been thinking about this talk that I was asked to give and how native plants benefit biodiversity. And it just really caught my attention, this little interaction. She wanted native plants, but she didn't want native plants that would get eaten by insects. And it occurred to me that there's a continuum, right? So we don't want to put plants out there that are going to get completely eaten, because then they die and then we're at ground zero again, right? Nobody wants to do that. But there's a continuum of interactions. When we plant native plants, a lot of things can happen and a lot of things will happen. Some of those are very, very helpful. Some of those can be quite harmful, right? But I think it's helpful to think about some of these interactions along this continuum. And you know, wounding way over here on the left, I got this picture of a buck who's been, you know, doing the buck rub on this poor little sapling. That does not look like a good thing for that tree, right? I think it'll probably have a tough time recovering. So it's hard to imagine how wounding could have a positive effect, especially wounding to this degree. On the other side, I've got mycorrhizae. So when plants form a relationship with the soil fungi, attaches to their roots, and the fungi helps to secure more water and nutrients for the plant gives off some sugars to the fungus. This mutualistic relationship seems to be very much a win-win relationship. It's hard to, I don't know of any situations where the mycorrhizae are harmful to the plant, right? So that's very helpful. And then all these other things I've got to, you know, situated along the continuum where they might be positive sometimes or have some positive effect, some negative effect. So we've got granivory, that's when organisms eat the seeds of a plant. It's hard for a seed to germinate if it's been eaten. Although, right, squirrels will bury some of the seeds. They think they're going to eat them later and then they don't dig them all up. And so then that can be a good thing. So while it's largely negative, it's over on the harmful side, it's not way at the end like the wounding. And then seed dispersal, you know, birds will eat the seeds or eat fruit, and then they'll distribute the seeds. Some of the seeds don't get damaged as they move through the bird's gut. And so there's a very positive thing, but some of them do. They might be damaged in the chewing or in the acid digestion. So, you know, it's not all the way over on the right. Anyway, you get the idea. I'm still working on this concept, but when we put plants out, just because they've been eaten doesn't mean that was a bad choice of a plant, right? In fact, it might mean that that was a really, really good choice of a plant, because whatever eats the plants we put out there can then be food for the next trophic level, right? You remember those food webs probably back in grade school or middle school or whenever you had it. Here's one I just chose because I liked it because you've got the plant here and that's got a whole bunch of insects, right? Insects are so important for supporting upper levels of biodiversity and especially birds. So actually, if we're thinking about the big picture of biodiversity, we want to put plants out there that are going to benefit the insects, and not just the pollination, but how about herbivory as well? Put plants out there that will support insects that eat them, and then you've got trophic levels that build on top of that. Right? I'm not advocating for 100% herbivory so our yards get cleaned right out by insects. That's a negative. But in general, there's a lot of herbivory that happens with native plants. This is another way to diagram this. You need to have, that bottom level is the producers. You need to have a lot of producers, a lot of plants in order to support the first level of herbivores. And here they show this cricket for the insects, right? And then every level you go up, there's less available energy for that next level. So if you want a lot of birds, you got to have so many insects. And if you want a lot of insects, you got to have a lot of plants, right? So I think we need to, in general, I think we need to broaden our sense of landscaping. We don't want plants that are always going to look great. That's not a yard that supports a lot of biodiversity, right? And Doug Tallamy, in one of his papers, wrote that 96% of non-seabirds in North America feed insects to their young. So that one really caught my attention as well. I've always thought about birds like cardinals as seed eaters. Look at that big fat beak, and you put out sunflower seeds and they'll eat them. This year we had a cardinal nest in our yard, a pair of them. And with COVID, we're eating outdoors a lot more. And so we really got to watch this pair of cardinals much more closely than we had in the past. And every evening, the male would go off to a perch two houses down, up on a dead perch out of a big old Chinese elm, and he would sing. And from that perch, he would sally out, just like he's a flycatcher, from time to time and grab an insect and then come back to his perch again. I was really surprised to see that behavior in the cardinal. But, he's probably one of that 96% that are feeding insects to his young. All right, I also want to highlight two papers, excuse me, research papers, just quickly, that underscore, I think, and show the importance of native woody plants for supporting biodiversity. So Tallamy and Shropshire back in 2009, this was published in Conservation Biology, where they basically looked at Lepidopteran. So these are moths and butterflies. And they evaluated both herbaceous and woody species, native and non-native, for how important they were for supporting the larvae of moths and butterflies. So moths and butterflies will lay their eggs on plants, and the eggs hatch, and then the larvae start to feed on those plants. We call these host plants. And what they found, here is a ranking of the native woody species that they evaluated in their paper. This is in New England. And notice the oaks come out the best. Pretty much any kind of assessment like this that's done, oaks score super high, usually #1. So they're very, very important. Prunus, so the cherries and the plums come right after the oaks. And this is the number of Lepidoptera that they found on those species. And you can see the ranking here, the top 20 native ones. The figure 1 here, this graph, that shows the introduced species on the left and native species on the right. And the scale here is the number of native Lepidopteran species that were found on those plants. Right, so for the introduced, the non-native plants, there's around 5 species, 5 genera, 5 species that are recorded on the genera of introduced plants. And then you look at the native ones. And what I found really amazing about this is look how important the native woody species are, because this number here, about 10 Lepidopteran species per plant genus, is when they consider all the plants, woody species and herbaceous together. But when they look at just the woody species, they've got over 70 Lepidopteran species per genus of a woody plant. So it really underscores the importance of those woody species for supporting moths and butterflies. Now, National Wildlife Federation just came out with a website where you can go there and plug in your area code. And it will give you the best host species for moths and butterflies in your area code. This is a really cool website. So I encourage you to take a look at it. www.nwf.org, Native Plant Finder, /plants. Right. Also, we just want to quick highlight one of my favorite books, Oak, the Frame of Civilization. William Bryant Logan writes this amazing book talking about the importance of oaks to both cultural and natural history around the world. It's really a fascinating read. All right. Our world would be a better place if we had more oak trees. That's the conclusion, basically, from all of this. The other research paper I want to tell you about is an older one, but it's a real classic. This showed up in the journal Ecology. Marquise and Whalen, 1994. They did a really interesting project. This was down in Missouri, where they looked at white oaks, and they standardized for the size of the white oaks. It's in a forest, in an intact forest. And they chose 20 of them randomly from this group of 60 that they sprayed with insecticide. 20 of them were controls. And then 20 of them, they actually caged with netting. And the netting was of a mesh so that insects could go back and forth, but the birds could not. Birds couldn't get in there. All right. So essentially what they have here with the sprayed trees is they have trees without insects, but birds can use the trees. With the control trees, we've got yes insects and yes birds. And with the cage trees, we've got yes insects, but no birds. Right? This is maybe a little bit complicated slide of some of their data. They evaluated things for 3 years after this treatment. And so this first graph up here, they show insect density in 1989. This is just the first year. So how many insects per given area leaf surface? And in the sprayed trees, right, they found very little. The spray killed so many of the insects. In the control, there was quite a bit more than the sprayed, but the control had far fewer insects than the cage did. So the caged trees had the most insect density because the birds couldn't get in there to eat them, right? So these controlled trees were getting fed on by the birds. They were eating the insects off those trees. And that pattern holds throughout all of the years that they assess things. I want to show you this last one, which actually is measuring now this is F, the biomass of the trees in 1991. So this is 3 years after they had done this. In 1991, they looked at the biomass of the trees, how much growth happened on those trees. And for the sprayed trees, it's split into these 3 columns, the total biomass, the leaf biomass, and the twig biomass. So when they look at this, the total of the twig and the total of the leaf, most of it's leaf. But I just want you to see the letters that are the same mean that those aren't different. So the biomass, the amount of growth on the trees that were sprayed was no different than the amount of growth on the trees that were under controls. So they had the birds and the insects. But both of those treatments had more growth than the trees that were in the cage, that were eaten by insects, and the insects were not fed upon by the birds. Right? So these birds are kind of acting like an insecticide, right? Because the difference here, there is no difference statistically. So the birds are cleaning the trees of the insects, so the trees grow better. The insects there are supporting the growth of the birds, right? And so you've got the start of this nice trophic interaction, and it shows the importance of native trees for biodiversity. All right, I'm going to just go through a list now. A short litany of benefits to biodiversity conveyed by native trees and shrubs. And I'll talk about some really good trees and shrubs for nectar, some really good trees and shrubs for fruit, and then ones that seem particularly tasty, so in terms of biomass, offering up themselves for insect digestion or insect feeding. And then I'll highlight some native trees and shrubs that are a host for particular Lepidoptera, some of the more charismatic ones. And then I've come across some other, I think, some really interesting case studies. So brace yourself for the others. Right. And a caveat, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. If your favorite woody species is not included, forgive me, but I couldn't include everything. One thing I definitely want you to know is that if you're thinking about native trees and shrubs for you, there's so many to choose from, right? There is so many to choose from. And anyway, just try some out. Here we go. Nectar plants. These are, I kind of chose these plants because when they're in flower, you can't hardly find a flower that doesn't have a pollinator on it. So St. John's wort, the Hypericum prolificum. There's another one, Hypericum calmii, which is a little smaller, but it's a really nice shrub. Grows to maybe 4 or 5 feet. and nice and dense. And those flowers are just spectacular. They look like fireworks. Meadowsweet, Spirea alba. When it's in bloom, it smells wonderful, and the insects can't resist. You know, any of the cherries. So this is a picture of pin cherry, or some people call it fire cherry, Prunus pennsylvanica. But choke cherry is great too. Sand cherry as well. So the cherries are wonderful for attracting pollinators. And I got some pictures of shrubby cinquefoil here, which is one that's used quite a bit in landscaping already. And just a couple others. I don't know how you can beat redbud in the spring. This is my house, by the way, welcome. And there's a redbud right in the front. It was a gift I gave my wife on Mother's Day, maybe a decade ago. It's a little bit of a selfish gift. I really wanted a redbud there. So anyway, it's worked well. And it's grown to the point where it's in front of this window. This is our daughter's bedroom. And I was in there cleaning this spring. And you know how your attention can be grabbed by movement. And I was in there cleaning, and I wasn't thinking about anything. And all of a sudden I noticed there's movement outside the window. So I quick looked, and the tree was in full flower, and it was just crawling with bees. And it's so exciting to see and to get a kind of a canopy view of it all. Ninebark is another one, a shrub in the rose family. That's just a real great attractor for pollinators. And any of the roses. Here I've got Carolina rose, which actually is planted right here in my little short grass prairie right out front. All right, then some fruit bearers. I like buttonbush a lot. The flowers are really terrific. It needs wet soils, but then it makes these spherical fruits that almost look like a sycamore. And the birds go in there and peck at them. I've seen chickadees and titmice, and so it's like a living bird feeder. A really nice ground cover, running strawberry bush down here in the bottom left corner. Gets a very interesting looking fruit, and really tough, resilient plant. Really nice native ground cover. The dogwoods, I just put silky and gray here. I've got gray right here. This picture is right from my backyard. And once those pedicels, once they get red like that, boy, those berries do not stay there long. That's an indication that they're ready for harvesting. Black gum is such a beautiful tree. It turns bright red in the fall. Also likes wet soils, but it makes this, also called tupelo, and makes these fruits about the size of a marble. They look a lot bigger right there. And then I don't know how you can not like maple leaf viburnum. You know, woodland shrub, tolerates shade, beautiful flowers, and lovely fruits. And just a couple other ones. Here's sand cherry down on the bottom, and then spice bush. I mean, it looks like somebody, you know, people have plastic fruit in a bowl sometimes. I mean, it's so shiny and perfect and really pretty fruit and a lovely plant. And American plum. We came across one of these this year. I was really excited in our ecosystem reserve at Calvin. I didn't know it was there. And we stumbled on it and got about 20 fruits. So I'm hoping to propagate this. Native Americans here in West Michigan, the Ottawa, were known to grow native plum orchards. So that one has some historical significance. Well, all of these probably have historical significance. It's just that we don't know all the connections. All right, a couple shout outs for elderberries. Red elderberry flowers in the spring, quite early actually, and then makes those really bright clusters of berries. And then the common elderberry, which likes it a little wetter, that one flowers midsummer. And right now there's a lot of fruit, or, you know, recently there was a lot of fruit. They get cleaned off pretty quick once they get ripe. They make a good jam as well. All right, so we went through nectar plants and some fruit producing plants. Just talk a little bit about herbivory. And the way I want to do this is just encourage you guys, as you're walking around this fall, take a look at some of the leaves on trees and shrubs where you go walking, and pay attention to the damage that's been done to them over the course of the summer. I was up at our family has property near Luther, Michigan, and I was up there a few weekends ago just for an afternoon, and it struck me that I could hardly find an undamaged leaf You know, it's a beautiful beech maple forest, all sorts of native plants, and almost every leaf had some kind of damage. And that's the way it's supposed to be this time of year. That's the way leaves are supposed to look. So a quick photo gallery as I walked around. This is all the same day. And I'm not just looking for leaves that were damaged so I could take a picture. You know, this was so typical. It really was amazing to me. But here's a beech, right? Here's a witch hazel. Here's an ironwood, wild black cherry. There's an amelanchier or serviceberry. That maple has been pretty beat up, sugar maple. Looks like somebody hit this ash with a shotgun almost, you know, look at that thing. Really beat up. And here's a yellow birch. Right. So once again, you know, this is good, right? This is how native plants support upper levels of biodiversity, right? By being eaten. This is a good thing. All right, a couple examples of host species. And the swallowtails probably illustrate this the best because many of them have a single host or, you know, at least a very strongly preferred single host. Without that plant around, they're not going to be nearly as successful, or maybe they won't even be able to reproduce. So just to be clear, what I'm talking about here is not, you know, you see this zebra swallowtail nectaring on Joe Pye. So the zebra swallowtail doesn't want anything to do with pawpaw's flowers or fruits, right? It wants the pawpaw so it can lay its eggs on pawpaw leaves or stems. The eggs will hatch and the caterpillar will feed off the leaves of the pawpaw. And the chemicals that are in the pawpaw leaf will get into the body of the larva, the caterpillar, and protect it, give it some protection against herbivory. So that's what we mean by a host plant. So if you want zebra swallowtails, plant pawpaws. You guys have more around Kalamazoo than we have up here in Grand Rapids. We're about at the northern extreme of pawpaws. But actually this picture of the fruit is one that we planted on Calvin's campus. And this is the first year that it's fruited. So I'm very excited about that. So the tiger swallowtail, its preferred host is wild black cherry. All right, that's the very interesting looking caterpillar for the tiger swallowtail. And I mentioned wild black cherry before, a really important plant for supporting all kinds of different insects, as well as birds. This is a picture I took of a wild black cherry this summer. And you see it's got the fall webworms on it. Which doesn't look great, but these things don't kill the trees. Even those tit caterpillars, even when they're really a major outbreak, they don't kill the trees. It's part of the tree's pathogen load, if you will, or parasite load. They support these other organisms, and then those organisms get eaten by other things. All right, spicebush swallowtail feeds on sassafras and spicebush, of course. Right. These are just amazing creatures. You know, those caterpillars are so decorative. And again, the world would be a better place if we had more of these guys. Sassafras does not fruit very often, but when it does, it has really beautiful fruits. And then these little pedicels that hold the fruit turn bright red. So prickly ash and hop tree are the host species for the giant swallowtail. And the giant swallowtail is a butterfly whose range extends far to the south. In the south, it's called an orange, I think this is called an orange dog, the caterpillar. And it feeds on citrus and can be a problem actually for citrus growers. We have two species in Michigan that are in the citrus family, in the Rutaceae. It's prickly ash and hop tree. So the giant swallowtail needs these two species for laying its eggs, and its caterpillars will eat them. We don't have a lot of orange trees up here in Michigan. I've got both these in my yard, and every summer we have giant swallowtails in my yard. So I can testify that it really, really works. All right, put the right plants out there and the insects will show up. Here's what I learned about this summer. I noticed this on one of the willows that was in our tree nursery at Calvin. And this is a spotted tussock moth, and its preferred host is willow. It will also do poplars and some birches, but its preferred host is willow. and it will emerge into this adult right here. But you know, willows, a lot of people think of as trash trees or weedy trees. I think we got to work to win back their reputation, maybe. They really do produce beautiful flowers. There are people like pussy willows, right? Why don't we plant some of those in our yards? And then we'll be helping creatures like the spotted tussock moth. I want to say something about New Jersey tea as well. This is a tough one to grow. If you've got open sunny area, especially sandy, that's its preferred habitat. It's a shrub that stays low, but it's a really important plant for all kinds of biodiversity. So I looked at North Carolina State University Extension site and got this quote. They write that it is a host plant for mottled dusky wing. That's this picture right here. The spring azure and the summer azure butterflies. Flowers are highly attractive to butterflies, bees, moths, predatory wasps, and other insects, and its seeds are eaten by songbirds. So it covers all of these different types of creatures. Just a really, really good plant and it's really beautiful as well. All right, here's my other category. So a couple other examples. And I'm not an entomologist, so these are things I just learned as I was putting the talk together. So I really, it's kind of fun doing talks, new talks for the first time. The learning curve is a lot steeper. I've often wondered what these, pine cone structures are on willows. It's a gall that's produced by the gall gnat midge, and that midge lives inside of it and feeds on the swollen tissue. So it induces the willow to form that growth, and then it's safe inside there, and then it can feed on that biomass. The one on the right is called a leaf roller. There's multiple species of leaf rollers. There's a willow leaf roller, and this will emerge as a moth. You can see one of the instars down here. So it's going through the various life stages all rolled up in here. It will eat off the willow leaves, but it pulls the leaves around it for protection. This is right from my front yard. I got some sumac out there, staghorn, and I saw these growths on the sumac, and so I did a little research. This is such an interesting situation. So this is caused by an aphid called the Sumac gall aphid. And an aphid will lay a single egg on the underside of the midvein of staghorn sumac leaflet. Right? Then when the egg hatches, the larva gives off some chemicals. It induces the plant to form this gall. So what you see there, it's referred to as this sumac apple, is all sumac biomass that's basically been reprogrammed to grow into this big, it's not quite as big as an apple, but it's about the size of a plum, this big gall. And the gall then forms around that aphid. And the aphid reproduces asexually inside of the gall into hundreds of clones. The picture in the bottom right is from inside of a gall I found online. Right, so these are all the little aphids that were produced asexually inside of this gall. And then later in the season, winged females are produced, who then leave the gall and they find moss where they mate with male aphids. So apparently the male aphids are hanging out in moss, and then the female progeny from that mating, they fly off to infect new sumac plants. So all this stuff is just going on right here in my yard. I'm wondering, I've been playing around with native plants and bonsai, and so I've been growing moss. So now I realize I got to check my moss for male aphids to see if that's been completing the cycle. Here's another one that that I noticed up in our property by Luther. This is hamamelidis, the witch hazel. And I saw these little pokey things on the leaf and did a little research. This is a cone gall aphid, Hormaphis hamamelidis. In this situation, there's a young, on a young spring leaf, a female aphid will inject a hormone. So she's not laying an egg, but she injects a hormone. For this example, the female injects a hormone and the witch hazel leaf grows this pokey thing around that aphid. Once she's surrounded by the leaf tissue, in this cone structure, she births 50 to 70 offspring. This is asexually as well. And they all feed together on the nutrients provided by that gall, right? And then after developing wings, the offspring will emerge from the gall in late fall. And females from this next generation lay eggs on other witch hazel stems. In the late fall, they overwinter and they hatch the following spring. And then the hatchlings will crawl onto the leaves. Now, you know, you might think too, aphids, they're bad for the plants, but when you produce so many aphids, that's food for other insects, and the other insects can be food for birds, et cetera, right? So even though these probably, there's no witch hazel out there that would like to have this condition, for the good of the whole community, the ecosystem, right? This is a good way that native plants support other levels of biodiversity. These guys are crazy. These are the leafcutter bees. 242 species in North America. People are starting to pay attention to these guys. They're really important pollinators, and they've been in decline. What they'll do is they'll cut out pieces of leaves of particular species, and then they line these channels with those leaves. This is not a cigar picture. This is just, somebody took this out of like a stem or a hollow tube. And the bees will lay their eggs inside there, and then they cap it off with a nicely cut piece that you see being held by that rubber glove. And here's my yard again. Remember, I live in a city. On the far left is redbud. Nice circle out of there. The middle picture is a bladdernut with lots of pieces taken out of it. And the right picture is chokecherry. So certain species of leafcutter bees will prefer certain species of plants. Native plants, right? You don't see circles being cut out of forsythias or, you know, name your other favorite non-native plant. These are native plants. And, you know, obviously you don't want to be using All right, Mourning Cloak, just a quick mention of this before I finish up. This is a fantastic creature. You'll see it flying around early in the spring. You think, how in the world did that thing come out already? Well, they overwinter, they hibernate. They do a lot of things like animals do. They rarely feed on nectar, but they much prefer tree sap and rotting fruit. So the Mourning Cloaks, really, really beautiful butterfly. Their preferred host is willow. So when they get around to laying eggs, they'll do it mostly on willows. But like I said, they have a lot of characteristics kind of like animals. They'll feign death if they're attacked by a predator. So playing possum. And males actually will defend territory against other males, right? And they hibernate. Really, really interesting creature. And by planting native plants, even ones that might get wounded and they start leaking some sap, well, that's exactly what Mourning Cloak's like. All right. And you can see some moist areas here on this. I think it was a sugar maple that this one is nectaring on. Nectaring, it's not nectar, he's sapping on it. Don't forget about bark. When you plant native plants, woody plants, you got bark. And there's a reason why nuthatches and woodpeckers move up the trunks of a tree. They're picking off insects, all right? So bark, especially when you've got textured bark like shagbark hickory, the birches, or wild black cherry. These are great reservoirs for insects, right? And the last thing I'm going to mention, I just came up with this last week. I was talking to a researcher at Michigan State, and he was telling me about some of the work they're doing there with viburnums. And he says viburnums not only, this is highbush cranberry, Viburnum opulus, they not only have extrafloral nectaries where sugary substances are produced in these non-floral discs for ants. So the ants drink this extrafloral nectar, and then they defend the plant against any herbivores that come. They also have what are called domatia. So these are areas on the underside of the leaves, and this is a picture of Viburnum opulus, but I have a Viburnum dentatum in my backyard, and I grabbed a leaf and threw it under a microscope here that I have in my office. And the Viburnum dentatum have the domatia too. So they've got these little hairs right in the axils of these veins, right? And it looks like it's sort of been debated for a long time what these structures are doing, but more recent research shows that they harbor a lot of mites. And some of these mites are predatory mites that patrol the leaf and will do things like graze on fungal patches that show up on the leaf, as well as take care of other mites that might cause problems. So the domatia seem to be houses, little houses for predatory mites. So this is just like breaking stuff. I mean, it's relatively new, so stay tuned, right? But you know that by planting, for whatever reason, you know that by planting native plants, there's going to be benefits to other elements of biodiversity. All right, so the summary of the take-home points. Here's a picture of a hackberry. By the way, hackberries look terrible this time of year, just terrible. You can't find a good-looking hackberry now because they're so important to native biodiversity. So native woody plants are great for supporting native biodiversity, especially as host plants for butterflies and moths. To get lots of birds, we need tons of insects. And to get tons of insects, we need plants that get eaten. So your garden is successful if you have damaged leaves in your garden. All right, it's a little different way of thinking about it. But when your garden looks all beat up in the fall, oh my goodness, that's such a great garden. Good job, all right? And there are lots of native trees and shrubs to choose from. I gave you just a small sampling in the pictures today, but there's so many. So let's give proper respect, back to Rodney Dangerfield, to our native woody species. Plant them in your yard, and then let the fun begin. All right, thank you very much, everybody. And I think we have some time for questions.
Okay, Dave, we have a couple of questions about recommendations for plants. So I think we'll you do those first, and then once I run out of these questions, we can open the mic to others. So one was about shade-tolerant plants. Can you recommend some shade-tolerant shrubs?
I think one that works really well is ribes cyanospati, which is the prickly gooseberry. That's one you always find in forests.
Okay,
yeah, the gooseberries. If it's wetter, there's other gooseberries that you can choose from as well, also known as currants.
Okay, and any flowers in particular too? I know you're talking about shrubs and trees.
Maple leaf viburnum would be a great one in the shade, particularly if it's sandy soil.
Great. All right. And then what about around foundation plantings?
I showed you that euonymus, the running strawberry bush. It's a really nice ground cover if you want something low. If you want something a little bit taller, I'm working with a church on some native plantings, and we're going to put in some of those St. John's worts, the shrubby St. John's worts, Hypericum prolificum. So that's a nice one, I think, around a foundation. They don't get tall and rangy, they stay compact.
Great, thank you. And then one that's on many people's minds, some good plantings for if you have lots of deer pressure and no fences.
Yeah. You know, shotgun approach. I would say put different things out there and see what they like. We did an experiment here at Calvin in our preserve where we have a lot of deer, and we planted elderberry, and we planted Spirea alba, and we planted Cornus sericea, the red stem dogwood, red osier, right? Those three, and we put in replicates all over the preserve. And here at Calvin, they mowed down the dogwood. Didn't even say thank you. They just ate it right down. And the elderberry, they did a pretty good number on, but they didn't touch the Spirea. So for a while, I was telling people, plant meadowsweet, you know, Spirea alba. Deer don't like it. And then somebody came back to me and said, I planted a bunch of elderberry like you, or Spirea like you said, and the deer just loved it. So I think deer in different areas have different tastes, or maybe, you know, one year versus the next is not always consistent, although they love hostas all the time. Which is fine because we don't have any native hostas, right? But so what I would say is try some different things and see once. They don't like everything. Oh, you know, one thing that lately I've seen they haven't been eating is hop tree, the Tilia trifoliata, and that's one of the hosts for the giant swallowtail.
Okay. And that
So
kind of leads,
a foolproof recipe.
yeah, there's always exceptions to the rule. In biology, you never say never.
That's right. That's another way to put it. Thanks.
And this relates to another question was, what are your thoughts on nativars?
Yeah, I think it's maybe I've got continuum on the brain, but I would log it into that category. The best is to use local genotypes of native species where you're confident. But a nativar, is going to be better than a non-native, and so, but it's not as good as a local native genotype.
Okay. And you talked about spice bush as being a good plant for attracting some critters. Yeah, but the spice bush plant itself. So that someone says they have a spice bush, but it doesn't fruit. So do they need a second one in order to get some pollination and fruit production? And if it did fruit, would they get more critters?
The spice bush flowers are either male or female, kind of like ilex, the winter holly. And so, yeah, you've got probably a male. And so I would plant a few more and hope that some of them are females, and then you'll probably get some fruits. They also are pretty sporadic in their fruiting. So you could also have a female that's just hasn't fruited. This year I've noticed it's a good year for spice bush fruit, but I would encourage you to plant a few more.
Okay, and you mentioned the swallowtails and some moths, and someone said they had a lot of clear-wing hummingbird moths this summer on their choke cherry and their red and black cherry. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't mentioned hummingbird moths or the sphinx moths, but boy, there's another whole group that's so fun to watch and so exciting when you see them. So no, I think whatever you're doing, if you're encouraging those, that's great. Keep it up. But boy, prunus, you can't go wrong with the prunus. Sand cherry, pin cherry, choke cherry, wild plum, and wild black cherry.
And someone's saying that you mentioned shrubby St. John's wort that might be good for foundation plantings, I think, but that the deer don't seem to like those either, or pawpaw.
They don't like pawpaw?
They don't like pawpaw.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that earlier. Some of those host plants, and I don't know if you noticed the picture I had of spice bush, the leaves look perfect. And spice bush has some pretty serious chemicals, hence its name, and its fragrance. And the pawpaws are the same. If you scrunch up a pawpaw leaf, there's a strong smell that comes out of there. So those guys have been producing some pretty serious chemicals. And so some of those hosts, especially if they're for the swallowtails, they're probably not going to be damaged too much by the deer because of the chemical composition. That's just a sense of mine. All right. And sort of experience, because pawpaw leaves this time of year can look really good too. They don't have much damage.
I have a nannyberry, and I've noticed that is just riddled. But I'm seeing it through new eyes now. I was a little worried.
Yeah.
But I'm glad to see those holes now.
Yeah, my viburnum dentatum back here too is, boy, a lot of the leaves have really been damaged bad. But right.
Near the end, so just a couple more questions here, and one is about propagation. So you guys do a lot of planting and restoration. Do you get students to help you on campus? Is that where you do most of the rearing of these natives?
Yeah, so we have been getting some grants from from Eagle, from the state, as well as EPA and Great Lakes Restoration Initiative grants. And with those grants, we always write in summer wages for students. So we get some students, and then oftentimes there's a match from Calvin. Calvin will support a student if we get to from a grant, that sort of thing. So we involve students as much as possible in this work. And yeah, a lot of it is propagation, and then also installing planting. Some of them are small, like residential rain gardens, but some of them are quite large. We're recreating floodplains in different sections along the creek. Yeah.
And when you talk about natives, I mean, how range specific are you when you're doing the gardening and the restorations? Like how far maybe
Yeah,
outside
so
of the zone you're working in?
that's a great question. We collect seeds. I was just out yesterday in Lowell State Game Area collecting some seeds. So probably 90% of the seeds we collect are from Kent County. So we stay right here. I'm not quite as, committed to that when you've got wind pollinated species. I figure the pollen is traveling a little bit further. So if I'm having a hard time finding bur oak acorns here around Grand Rapids, and I see some down when I'm in Benton Harbor or something, I'll grab some of those and put them in my pocket. So, we're not legalistic about it, but we try to do as much as we can with seeds that have been collected locally right here in Kent County.
All right. Maybe one more question here. Is the maple leaf viburnum susceptible to the European viburnum beetle?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Okay, someone says that the beetle killed their large arrowwood viburnum last year.
Good question. I don't know. I'd have to Google that, or you guys are having Doug Landish next month, right? That'd be a good question for Doug.
Okay, we'll hold that one. Maybe one quick last one.
Okay.
Recommendations for hedgerows.
Oh man, I've got a little hedge of meadowsweet, Spirea alba. It grows pretty dense. Boy, we've got. This is an interesting question because we don't often make hedges out of native plants. But I wonder about speckled alder, because we've got some at our greenhouse, and I keep tipping them back, and they just grow fuller and fuller to the point where now I'm looking, boy, if I line those things up, they'd make a pretty nice hedge. So the speckled alder, red alder sometimes, or tag alder, some people call it. That might be one to try. I don't know, give it a shot. If you can find a good price on, a couple dozen of the same species, put them together and see what happens. So sounds like a good experiment.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Neil now.
Okay, everyone. Thank you, Dave, and thank you to everyone who attended our meeting tonight. Little glitch in there, but I think we definitely learned a lot about how to run these meetings. So I promise our next one is going to be even better. Please be sure to come back next month on Wednesday, October the 28th at 7 p.m. And I will share a little slide here. Sorry, as I continue on talking. So next month, Wednesday, October the 28th at 7 p.m., titled Insects in Decline, Conservation Opportunities. And our presenter is Dr. Doug Landis, Professor of Entomology at Michigan State University. So we hope to see you then. Good night, everyone.